May 1945. The ruins of Berlin. The war was over. The Reich lay in ashes. General Wilhelm Strasser stood in the rubble of what had once been the War Ministry and watched American soldiers enter the city. He was 52 years old. He had commanded armies. He had studied strategy at the finest military academies in Europe. He had believed, until very recently, that Germany represented the pinnacle of military science, of tactical brilliance, of warrior culture refined over centuries. He had been trained to think in terms of force and will, of dominance and submission, of victory achieved through the complete destruction of the enemy's capacity to resist. He had expected many things in this moment: vengeance, brutality, the kind of pitiless retribution that the SS had perfected in the East, now turned back upon Germany itself. He had seen what German forces did to defeated enemies. He had walked through villages in Russia where not a single building stood intact, where the population had been systematically eliminated or enslaved. He had read reports from Poland, from Ukraine, from Belarus. He knew what his nation had done. He assumed the Americans would do the same. It was what victors did. It was the logic of war, ancient and absolute. He was wrong. The American army that rolled through the shattered streets of Berlin was unlike anything he had anticipated. They came with overwhelming force. Sherman tanks in endless columns, their numbers so vast they seemed to stretch to the horizon. Artillery pieces that had reduced the most formidable fortresses to rubble. Aircraft that filled the sky like migrating birds. Thousands of them, B-17s and B-24s, that had turned German cities into infernos. The industrial might of a nation that produced more steel in a month than Germany had produced in a year. More ammunition in a week than the Wehrmacht had fired in the entire Battle of Stalingrad. They had crushed the Reich with a mechanical precision that bordered on the supernatural, a demonstration of raw productive capacity that made a mockery of every calculation the German High Command had made about American weakness, about American softness, about American inability to wage total war. But they also came with something else. Food. Medicine. Engineers who began clearing rubble before the last shots had even faded. Strasser watched an American sergeant, 20 years old, maybe younger, with the smooth, unlined face of someone who had grown up with enough to eat, kneel beside a German child in the street. The boy was maybe 6. Filthy. Starving. Wearing rags that had once been clothes. His legs were stick-thin. His eyes were hollow. He looked like the children Strasser had seen in photographs from the ghettos, from the camps, children who existed at the very edge of life, held there by will alone. The sergeant opened his pack, pulled out a chocolate bar, and handed it to the child. The boy stared at it, stared at the uniform, did not understand, did not trust. The sergeant smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and gestured for the boy to eat. Made the motion with his own hand, universal, unmistakable. The boy's mother appeared from a doorway, skeletal, gray, moving like a ghost. She saw the American, saw her son with the chocolate, and her face contorted with an emotion Strasser could not quite identify. Not fear, not exactly. Something more complicated. The sergeant stood, dug in his pack again, produced 2 cans of meat, and handed them to the woman. She took them with hands that trembled. She tried to speak. No words came. She bowed instinctively, the gesture automatic. The sergeant nodded, touched his helmet in a kind of salute, and moved on to the next cluster of refugees. The scene repeated itself up and down the street. American soldiers distributing rations, setting up field kitchens, treating wounded civilians, German civilians, enemy civilians, with the same care they gave their own wounded. Strasser watched a medic bandage the leg of an old man who still wore the faded uniform of the Wehrmacht, who probably had been shooting at Americans a week ago. The medic worked carefully, professionally, explaining what he was doing in broken German, his hands gentle, despite the language barrier. Strasser felt something crack in his understanding of the world. For 6 years, the German propaganda machine had told them about the Americans. Decadent, soft, a mongrel nation of immigrants with no real culture, no discipline, no warrior spirit. They were gangsters and cowboys, the propaganda said. They fought without art or skill, relying on crude industrial superiority to compensate for their lack of true martial excellence. They were cowards who would break under pressure, who lacked the will to accept casualties, who would sue for peace the moment the war became difficult. Every part of this had been proven false. The Americans had landed at Normandy and absorbed casualties that would have broken lesser armies. They had fought through the hedgerows of France, through the frozen hell of the Ardennes, through the Gothic line in Italy. They had not broken. They had not faltered. They simply kept coming, wave after wave, supported by an industrial base that seemed like something from science fiction. When the Wehrmacht destroyed an American tank, 3 more appeared to replace it. When a division was mauled, fresh troops arrived within days. The Americans fought with a combination of material superiority and tactical flexibility that German commanders had never encountered before. But this compassion, this immediate shift from destroyer to rebuilder, this was something beyond Strasser's comprehension. He walked through the city over the following days and watched the occupation unfold. The Americans were setting up distribution centers for food and medical supplies. They were clearing streets, restoring water systems, hanging signs in German and English explaining where civilians could receive aid. They brought in radio equipment and broadcast information about food distribution, about medical care, about the location of displaced persons. They established order not through terror, but through efficiency, through the simple demonstration that cooperation would be rewarded, that the Americans were here not to destroy, but to rebuild. This made no sense according to the logic Strasser had been taught. You destroyed your enemy. You broke them completely. You made them understand that resistance was futile, that their only option was absolute submission. You did not feed them. You did not heal them. You did not treat them with dignity and respect. That was weakness. That invited future rebellion. That showed you lacked the will to do what was necessary. And yet, the Americans were doing exactly that, and it was working. The civilian population, which had been prepared to resist, to fight in the streets, to die rather than submit, they were simply giving up. Not out of fear, out of confusion, out of the impossible cognitive dissonance of being treated humanely by an enemy you had been taught to hate and fear. It was a form of conquest more complete than any military victory could achieve. The Americans were winning not just the war, but the peace. And they were doing it through a combination of overwhelming force and unexpected mercy that left the German mind struggling to find categories for what it was witnessing. Strasser was not alone in his confusion. In the weeks following the surrender, as senior German officers were gathered for interrogation and processing, they spoke to one another in whispered conversations, trying to understand what had happened. Field Marshal von Richter, who had commanded Army Group Center, sat in a detention facility and stared at the ceiling and spoke to no one. When he finally did speak, his words were quiet, almost wondering. He said, "They could have done anything to us. Anything. We would have deserved it. We knew what was coming in the East. The Soviets were taking their revenge, burning and killing, destroying everything. We expected the same from the Americans. We had prepared our families for it, told them to hide, to run, to end their lives rather than face what was coming. And then the Americans arrived, and they fed people. They gave medicine to our wounded. They treated prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions we had ignored. They showed restraint." He paused, his face troubled. How do you fight an enemy like that? How do you sustain hatred against people who show you mercy when they have every right to show you none? General Helmuth Krauss, who had been one of the architects
General Helmuth Krauss, who had been one of the architects of the Blitzkrieg, spoke of his experiences with American commanders during the initial interrogations. They were professional, he said, correct, but also curious. They asked about our tactics, our strategy, not to humiliate us, but to understand. They treated us as fellow soldiers, as professionals, even after everything we had done, even knowing what we had done. He shook his head. I kept waiting for the mask to drop, for the veneer of civility to crack and reveal the vengeance underneath. It never did. They were genuinely interested in preventing future wars, in understanding how this catastrophe had happened so it could never happen again. They thought like builders, not destroyers. Even in victory, even surrounded by the ruins of cities they had bombed, they were already thinking about reconstruction. This was perhaps the most difficult thing for the German military mind to process. The Americans had demonstrated the capacity for total war, for industrial-scale destruction, for the complete annihilation of enemy forces. The bombing campaigns alone had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, had reduced ancient cities to rubble, had demonstrated a willingness to inflict whatever damage was necessary to achieve victory. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin itself. The Americans and British had shown they could be as ruthless as any army in history when circumstances required it. But they had also shown that they could stop, that they could transition from war to peace not gradually, but immediately, as if flipping a switch. The same soldiers who had been killing Germans with mechanical efficiency one day were feeding German children the next. The same nation that had produced the atomic bomb, a weapon so terrible it had ended the war in the Pacific with 2 strikes, was also producing the Marshall Plan, a comprehensive program to rebuild Europe, including Germany, at a cost of billions of dollars. This paradox was incomprehensible to men who had been trained to see the world in terms of strength and weakness, dominance and submission, victory and defeat. Strasser spent months in an American detention facility, comfortable by the standards of military prisons, certainly comfortable compared to what he knew awaited German prisoners in Soviet hands. He was questioned repeatedly, not tortured, not threatened, simply questioned. The American intelligence officers were thorough, professional, sometimes even friendly. They brought him coffee. They discussed military tactics with genuine interest. They treated him like a colleague, albeit one from the losing side. One day, a young American captain named Henderson sat across from Strasser in an interrogation room and asked him a question that cut to the heart of everything. "Why did you think we would be cruel?" Henderson asked. His German was good, studied, careful. "Why did your propaganda insist we were barbarians when we had never acted that way in any previous war? We treated German prisoners well in World War I. We have a long tradition of laws governing warfare, of trying to minimize civilian casualties, of respecting surrendered enemies. Why did you believe we had suddenly become monsters?" Strasser considered the question. He was tired. The war was over. There was no point in maintaining the old lies. He said, "Because we were cruel, because we committed atrocities and justified them as necessary, and we assumed that everyone else was like us, that everyone else would do what we did if given the opportunity. We could not imagine strength combined with restraint, power combined with mercy. In our thinking, you were either strong and ruthless, or you were weak and merciful. We could not conceive of being both." Henderson nodded slowly. "That was your mistake," he said. "You confused mercy with weakness. You thought compassion was a luxury only the weak could afford. You never understood that real strength is defined not by the ability to destroy, but by the ability to show restraint when you have the power to destroy. Any army can kill. Any nation with enough weapons can inflict suffering, but it takes real power, moral power, not just military power, to win a war and then immediately begin rebuilding what you've destroyed, to feed your enemy's children, to treat the wounded and sick regardless of which side they fought for, to turn enemies into allies instead of grinding them into the dust." Strasser had no answer to this. He sat in silence, thinking about his nation, about the choices they had made, about the philosophy that had led them to this ruin. Germany had believed in strength as an absolute, in the will to power, in the idea that history belonged to those willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve their goals, that moral considerations were obstacles to be overcome, that compassion and mercy were weaknesses that had no place in the serious business of statecraft and war. This philosophy had led them to commit unspeakable crimes. It had led them to build an empire of death camps and slave labor. It had led them to believe that they could reshape the world through force, that other nations would simply bow before German military excellence and accept their subordinate place in the new order. And it had led them to total defeat. The Americans had a different philosophy. Or rather, they had the same capacity for force, but combined it with something else, something the German mind had not accounted for. A genuine belief in certain principles that transcended national interest. Democracy, human rights, the rule of law. These were not just propaganda slogans. The Americans actually seemed to believe them, seemed to structure their behavior around them, even when it would have been easier, more efficient, more immediately beneficial to abandon them. Strasser saw this in how the Americans conducted the occupation. They could have simply imposed military rule, governed through decree and force. Instead, they began the complicated process of democratic reconstruction. They held trials, actual trials, with lawyers and evidence and due process for war criminals. They could have simply executed everyone they considered complicit in Nazi crimes. Instead, they built a legal framework, established precedents, treated even the worst criminals as human beings entitled to some form of justice rather than mere revenge. They could have reduced Germany to an agrarian society, eliminated its industrial capacity, kept the population at subsistence level as punishment for what the Reich had done. There were voices in America calling for exactly that. But the Marshall Plan pumped resources into rebuilding German industry, German infrastructure, German civil society. The Americans calculated that a prosperous, democratic Germany was more valuable than a prostrate one, that creating a strong ally was preferable to maintaining a permanent enemy. This was long-term thinking, strategic thinking, but it was also moral thinking. It represented a belief that even enemies could be redeemed, that even a nation that had committed monstrous crimes could potentially become something better. This was so foreign to the Nazi worldview, which divided humanity into superior and inferior races, which saw history as an eternal struggle where the strong dominated the weak, that most German commanders simply had no framework for understanding it. But they could see the results. Within months of the surrender, German cities were functioning again. Trains were running, factories were reopening. Children were back in schools, though now being taught a very different curriculum. The Americans were not just occupiers, they were partners in reconstruction, working alongside German civilians to build something new from the ruins of the old. The contrast with the Soviet occupation in the East could not have been more stark. There, the Red Army was taking revenge, dismantling factories, shipping machinery back to Russia, treating the German population with the same brutality that the Wehrmacht had shown in Russia. The Americans could have done the same. They chose not to.
By 1947, Strasser was released from detention. He returned to what remained of his home to find his family alive, his house damaged but standing, his city slowly coming back to life. American aid was everywhere. Food shipments, medical supplies, construction materials. The contrast between what he had expected and what had actually occurred was so vast, it felt like living in two different realities. He walked through a park where children were playing, German and American children together. The Americans, the sons and daughters of occupation forces, the Germans, the children of former soldiers and civilians. They were playing baseball, an American game, laughing and shouting in a mixture of English and German. An American soldier was teaching them, showing them how to hold the bat, how to throw the ball. The scene was so ordinary, so peaceful, so completely at odds with everything the war had been. Strasser sat on a bench and watched. An elderly woman sat down beside him. They did not speak for a long time. Then she said, quietly, "I lost 2 sons in the war. My husband, my brother. The Americans killed them. I hated the Americans with everything I had." She paused. "Then the Americans came and they gave me food. They brought medicine for my granddaughter when she was sick. They treated her even though we had no money, no ability to pay. They saved her life." She was crying now, silent tears running down her wrinkled face. How do you hate someone who saves your grandchild? How do you maintain that hatred when they show you kindness you don't deserve? I want to hate them. Part of me still does, but I can't. They won't let me. They keep being human when I need them to be monsters. This was the paradox that broke the German understanding of power. The Americans had shown that true strength was not the absence of mercy, but the choice to show mercy even when you had the power to show cruelty. They had demonstrated that you could fight a total war, could bring the full weight of industrial civilization to bear in destroying your enemy, and then immediately switch to rebuilding that enemy into something better. This required a kind of moral discipline, a kind of civilizational confidence that Germany had lacked. Germany had fought from a position of perceived weakness, believing it had to dominate or be dominated, had to conquer or be destroyed. The Americans fought from a position of actual strength, secure enough in their own power that they could afford to be merciful, confident enough in their values that they could trust in reconstruction rather than revenge. The German generals, products of a military culture that went back centuries, trained to think in terms of annihilation and total victory, could not fully grasp this. They could see it happening, they could acknowledge that it was working, but they could not truly understand the mindset that made it possible. To them, mercy and power existed in opposition. You were either strong enough to crush your enemies, or weak enough that you had to compromise with them. The idea that you could be strong enough to crush your enemies, but choose instead to rebuild them, choose to transform them from enemies into allies, choose to invest in their prosperity rather than their subjugation, this represented a fundamentally different philosophy of power. It was a philosophy that would shape the second half of the 20th century. Germany became democratic. It became prosperous. It became one of America's closest allies. The same nation that had fought the most destructive war in human history became a pillar of European stability and cooperation. This did not happen by accident. It happened because the Americans made a choice in 1945 to treat their defeated enemy not with the revenge that would have been understandable, even justified, but with a combination of justice and mercy that opened the door to genuine transformation.
The Marshall Plan cost the United States billions of dollars. American taxpayers funded the reconstruction of cities their own bombers had destroyed. They fed populations that had supported a regime dedicated to their destruction. They made a massive investment in people who had been their mortal enemies just months before. This was not naive. This was not weakness. This was strategy at the highest level. The understanding that creating allies was more valuable than maintaining enemies. That building prosperity was better than enforcing poverty. That mercy could be more powerful than revenge.
Wilhelm Strasser lived until 1973. He never fully reconciled what he had seen with what he had been taught to believe. He wrote in his private journals about the cognitive dissonance of experiencing American power and American mercy simultaneously, of being defeated so completely and then treated so well. He struggled with guilt over his role in the war, over the crimes his nation had committed, over the years he had spent serving a regime that he now understood had been evil in ways he had been unwilling to see at the time. But he also wrote about the baseball games, about the children playing in rebuilt parks, about the Germany that had emerged from the ashes, democratic and peaceful and prosperous, about the fact that his grandchildren would grow up in a world where Germany and America were allies, where the war was history rather than present reality, where the future held possibility rather than just the repetition of past hatreds. In one of his final entries, written in 1972, he reflected on the question that had haunted him since 1945. "We never understood how they could fight with both power and mercy," he wrote. "We thought these were opposites, mutually exclusive, that you had to choose one or the other. We chose power without mercy, and it led us to ruin. The Americans chose both, and it led them to the strongest peace the world has ever known. They won the war with their weapons, but they won the future with their values. That is the lesson we failed to learn, the wisdom we lacked. True power is not the absence of restraint. True power is having the ability to destroy and choosing instead to build. That is what we never understood. That is why they won not just the war, but everything that came after." He died believing that his generation of German officers had been not just defeated, but intellectually surpassed, that the Americans had discovered something about the nature of power and civilization that the German military tradition had missed entirely. He died knowing that the world his grandchildren would inherit was better because of American choices in 1945, because of the decision to show mercy when revenge would have been easier, to invest in former enemies rather than grinding them into permanent subjugation. The 20th century had many dark chapters: the Holocaust, the bombings, the millions of dead. But it also had this: the demonstration that enemies could become allies, that mercy could be strategic, that the strongest nations were not those most willing to inflict suffering, but those capable of combining overwhelming force with deliberate restraint. The German generals never fully understood this during their lifetimes, but their children did, and their grandchildren, and the Europe they built together with America, rising from ruins, choosing democracy over dictatorship, choosing cooperation over conquest, choosing a future defined not by the hatreds of the past, but by the possibilities of peace. That Europe stood as testimony to a simple truth that the Third Reich had never grasped: that real power is measured not by how completely you can destroy your enemies, but by how completely you can transform them into friends. That mercy is not weakness, but the ultimate expression of strength. That the most devastating weapon is not the bomb or the bullet, but the offered hand, the shared meal, the choice to build rather than to destroy. The Americans understood this in 1945. They fought with everything they had, and then they fed the children of the men they had killed. They rebuilt the cities they had bombed.
They turned enemies into allies through the simple revolutionary act of treating defeated populations not as subjects to be exploited, but as humans to be helped. That is why Germany never understood, because understanding would have required abandoning everything they believed about power, about strength, about what it meant to win. The Americans won the war, but more importantly, they won the peace. And they did it not by standing on the necks of their enemies, but by helping them stand again. That was power. That was mercy. That was both at once. And that changed everything.